Amy Julia, good. It's good to see you. It's
It's
always good.
great to be here. Thank
I
you.
know
Thank you.
it's always good to see you, and I'm so excited to talk about this book that I really think, like I told you before, I do think this is your best book yet, and that's saying a lot because your all your other books are really good, and so beautifully written, but this one, you talk about so many different aspects of healing and involves so many of the different areas that we need healing that we might not even be aware of. And I
Mm.
just think that there's going to be different parts that speak to very different people. So that's amazing. But let's just start with, I feel like you've been writing this book your whole life.
It does kind of feel that way. And I think for you, as someone who's known me almost my whole life with a story that starts from,
High
30
school.
years ago, it's like, yeah, this has been a topic of relevance in my life for a really long time.
It really has. And I feel like this was kind of the mantle you were given to carry,
Mm,
because it weaves in so many of your life experiences. And in that way, it reads so authentically. You're not writing about something that you've learned. You're writing about something that you've lived.
mm.
Yes, you've learned about it along the way, but this is your life story. And I feel like in some ways, your life's message. And that comes across so beautifully. So let's just talk about, because you've woven together all these different parts. First of all, how did you know you needed to write this book? What made you write this book?
That's a good question. So I mean, the so there was kind of like there's a story in the book that goes back 30 years, but then there's another story that goes back, I think, 7 years. Like I think
Mhm.
in about 7 years ago, I had this chronic back pain and went through a lot of attempts to deal with it, but eventually sat down with a yoga teacher and experienced a form of healing, like immediate kind of spontaneous healing that was really weird to me. Huge relief. I was very grateful, but I also was like, what just happened? Like,
Happened.
this has never happened to me before. I don't understand. And it really pushed me to think about healing differently and to think about my need for healing, how healing happens, and especially as a Christian who's just experienced healing through an encounter with someone who is not a Christian, and just wondering like what is going on here, and what does this tell me about like God's role in healing. So I had all those questions, and that really, I mean, led me for years to be thinking, praying, and experiencing and like studying the gospels when it comes to healing, but as you said, it wasn't just something I learned, it was something I was living, but I wasn't ready to write about it. So this was, or I wasn't ready to write about it for the public, because I was still so much in the midst of asking all of these questions and just wondering what about my story would be something for other people, because I think there are things that God wants us to have that are really just for us, and that's fine, right? And so I remember once I sat down and I was like, I'm going to take this week and I'm going to write down all the different healing experiences that I've had. And I wrote them down kind of thinking maybe this is the beginning of a book. And I read them and I was like, yeah, no one really cares that my wrist was hurting and then it felt better. Like, it was really profound to me, but like that is just not that helpful to other people. So it was good that I did that, but it was also kind of like, I don't know what to do with all this. And so it really was just this years in the making until I wrote my book, White Picket Fences. That came out in 2018, but like all of this probably started in 2015, so it'd been going. That came out in 2018. And really, I saw White Picket Fences as being about social healing, like a
Hmm.
big picture healing, and had a lot of conversations over the course of the years after that came out. So this book, in some ways, came before that book, but it also came out of that book because of learning how my story and experience of healing was actually connected to this bigger story of healing in the, going back to the Bible, and also going out into our world and communities and live right now.
What has been so interesting just watching your different ailments and pain is how your body manifests what is happening internally. And you write about that. I've written about that. I've witnessed that with patients forever,
Yeah.
and even myself. Um, and you talk about that in the book, but I want you to tell the story about your eye twitching. Do you remember that? Because you didn't write about
Oh
that in
yes,
the
I
book,
do.
did you? Did you write
It's
about it
in
in the
White
book?
Picket Fences, actually. So
Oh, that's right.
so
Okay.
that, yeah. So I have written about it, although it's not in this book. But in White Picket Fences, what I discovered, I had this eye twitch and was like, why is my eye twitching? This has never happened in my life before. And I was like, is it because I'm on the computer too much? But then it would twitch when I wasn't in front of the computer, or like it would not twitch when I was in front of the computer, So I was like, that's not it, whatever. And over time, as I started observing when my eye was twitching, it was when I was either working on or thinking about White Picket Fences, which is a book about privilege and social division and racism and social class and all of these things. And I realized, again through conversation, but I was like, oh, I'm flinching. Like, I am afraid of what is going to get thrown at me when I put these words out into the world. And so once I realized that this was like a fear response that I didn't even know I had, like I didn't consciously feel afraid about writing that book, but clearly my body was like, oh yeah, yeah, but you are afraid. And so once I recognized that, I was able, every time my eye started to twitch, to just like pause and take some deep breaths and pray for courage and pray that God would protect me, and consider the reason I was putting the words out into the world, that it was not because I was trying to start a fight, it was because I wanted to be a participant in healing. And so the twitch, I mean, it really did go away, and it would come back and it would go away, and it would come back. But there was this sense of that, I don't know, ailment or whatever being an invitation to actually look a little more closely at what was not going on in my body, but like going on in my heart and my soul and my relationships, and to really pay attention to those in a way that could lead me to a place of deeper peace.
I love that. I'm going to get back to this being an invitation and what that means, because I highlighted a part of your book that talks about that. It was interesting. I don't remember if it was you or someone who talked to me about my shoulder pain, because that was my major physical ailment over the last few years. I had
Yeah.
frozen shoulder
Yep.
and I couldn't lift up this arm, and it got to the point where I couldn't sleep at night. And that was at a point where I was not really looking at what internally was going on, other than I knew that I had stress. But I remember who it was, someone said, well, maybe you're shouldering too much, and your body's telling you that you can't handle this much, or maybe this is not healthy for you. And I never thought about it like that. I mean, me here, like the psychotherapist, I'm part of it is everyone's medical in my family, right? So they
Right.
literally just look at Ed's like, okay, I'm literally cooking dinner. And he walks behind me and gives me a cortisone shot while I'm cutting
Right.
vegetables.
Right.
It's just like, here, this is the treatment. But
Yes.
this book that you've written, I mean, just on one level, is an invitation for all of us to look at, what is your body saying to you about what's going on in your life? And I love how, and you talk about Gabor Mate, and how the body keeps score, just how integrated we are, the mind, body, spirit. I think it was Glennon Doyle who talked about us being our own Trinity. And if you think
Hmm.
about, the mind, body,
Yeah.
spirit, being reflection of God, who is a
Yeah.
Trinity, that makes perfect sense. Yeah,
Right.
everything's going to be so connected. Um, so just thoughts that you have about that while I pull up this passage.
Yeah. So I think the thing I have really begun to believe is that there's absolutely a place for the cortisone shot, for the therapist couch, like, just that sense of
Yes.
we need these tools, and yet they are insufficient in and of themselves. Like, when we are just looking for that pain in our body or in our mind or relationships as like having a quick fix, it's that what that usually does is it means we're not actually getting at whatever the deeper message, the deeper learning, the deeper healing that is available to us. And I think we often need like the Advil or the surgery even to kind of like stop the problem for a moment, like to hit pause so that we can find the space to pay attention and say, what is really going on here? But what we do in America, certainly what I do, is we're like, I don't want to find out what's really going on here. I just want to keep going with my life. And could you make my shoulder feel better so that I don't have to change any of my patterns? Because
Yes.
that would be really inconvenient and kind of scary. And I might disappoint people, and I might have to face myself in ways that I don't want to. And I think all the time, because I often, whether it's like tightness in my shoulder or pain, And I do often now, whenever a part of my body is hurting, I ask the question, like, is there a message that I am denying on an emotional or spiritual level that my body is trying to get me to pay attention to? And again, that doesn't mean I wouldn't take medication. It just means that even if I'm taking the medication, I'm also trying to ask those questions and pay attention so that the deeper healing can also happen.
I think that's a great way of thinking of it, because I know some people, right, especially who are kind of inundated in that Western medicine thinking, this is going to be like a lot for them to understand that, oh, there's more to pain than pain, right?
Yeah.
There's more, but I think especially now as more research is coming out, just how on the neural networks, emotional and physical pain are actually processed on similar neural networks,
Right.
seeing similar psychosocial histories and certain chronic illnesses, how they're so related. This book is coming out at a really good time where people are more aware, and not to mention so many of us need healing on different levels coming out of this pandemic, um,
Right.
and everything politically that's happened and is still happening.
Yeah, I agree. I think I did read a lot of like not faith-based books about healing in order to see, both like, does faith have anything to do with healing, or is that
Mm,
just my way of interpreting it? And also, like, how do people who don't have kind of like a faith perspective understand healing that doesn't seem to happen simply through medication? Like, and what do we think about these ideas of like emotional healing or stress, and then the degree of like disease and stress connection. So you
yep.
mentioned like Gabor Mate, and then The Body Keeps the Score as a different book, and then I just read a book called Cured, which is also about spontaneous remission of cancer and things like this, and like what are the ways in which stress in our lives, whether that's environmental stress like pollution, right, like, or the stress of relationships that are in broken places, or our own insistence that we have to perform or achieve, any of those types of stress can have these like very real effects on our bodies. And I'm fascinated by the way it all interacts. And I don't think it's the same for everyone, but there are these like big conclusions we can draw that help us to know that when we pay attention to our bodies, we're paying attention to more than just like
Mm,
a physical something, right? Like there's a
mm-hmm,
physical, emotional, spiritual, as you said, that we think about it as these three different things that are meant to really all be one thing, like the
mm-hmm.
self, right?
Yeah,
But we don't know how to think about it that way, or at least
yeah.
I have not been taught that. I'm still learning.
You're teaching people through this book, though, and
Mm,
the examples that you give are so compelling that kind of force us to say it doesn't make sense another way. It doesn't make sense another way. um you say when you got healed from the back pain, you say relief from pain was only the beginning. That moment also offered an invitation to explore shame and fear and loneliness, an invitation to experience wonder, delight, and joy, an invitation to participate in a larger work of healing. So that's a big invitation, because if we're exploring shame and fear and loneliness and at the same time wonder, delight, and joy, how does that all go together?
I love that you picked that out. Yeah, so I think one of the reasons I shy away from admitting that pain might have like a deeper root is because of a fear of like acknowledging that there can't that the ways in which like shame and fear and loneliness are present, right? So instead of saying, gosh, maybe the reason my back hurts is because I don't really know who I am. And well, I'll back up just a minute. When I was talking with this yoga teacher, I said, I think I have a problem with alignment. And I meant by that my body was not aligned
Mhm.
correctly. And so a yoga teacher should help me put it back in line. And she
Yeah.
said, every time I hear someone use the word alignment, I think there's something that's not aligned in your life, not something that's not aligned in your body. And I was kind of like, oh,
Oops.
because I knew she was
Yeah.
right. Like
Yeah.
I had been living this life where I was just like playing a part rather than bringing who I really am, because I didn't really know who I was. I didn't know how to, if I thought, gosh, if I bring my true self into social situations, I'm going to be rejected. People aren't going to like it. I'm too much. I mean, it's such an interesting thing. The word you use, like, I'm too much and I'm not enough. And I had both of those going in different ways. And I learned later that those really are kind of like code words for shame.
Yes.
And so it was this sense of, I've got to look really, if I'm going to be healed of this back pain, it is not just about stretching in the proper way or taking an Advil. It's about looking at the things that are not aligned in my life. And in my case, that was saying, gosh, I feel afraid, I feel ashamed, I feel lonely. But what happens as I start doing that work is that I learn I don't have to feel that way. And that's where that like sense of wonder and joy. And so there's a going in deeper into the wound really in order to find that what can go underneath that is like a deeper love. And
Mm,
so that was where that and then there's a freedom I think that comes that allows us to not only experience healing but like live out of that healing, bring that into our other relationships and into our communities, because we're not in that place of like shame, fear, denial, distraction, at least not quite on the same level anymore. Not to say I've
mm.
overcome all shame, fear, and distraction.
I think that's an ongoing process, right? But you're talking about just being authentic with ourselves, being honest, facing the truth of who we are, and then being vulnerable about that. And
Yeah.
I think that that's gotten a lot harder to do. And I talk a lot about social media and the impact that has on us because we've created the picture of how we want to be perceived, and
Mhm.
oftentimes our identity is based on the perceptions of other people, right? And it's easy to buy into that identity that we have the power to create, but
Mhm.
losing the truth and authenticity of who we are in that process. And I think when we can actually confront it and accept it and embrace it, um, is when the healing happens, right? We don't have that pressure and the stress of trying to believe that we have to be something that we're actually not. Um, so
Yeah, I think
I love that.
there's like tremendous healing that happens in believing that we are loved, we are, and not for who we're supposed to be or who someone else has decided we're, going to be someday, but actually believing our belovedness is like a huge aspect to healing. And I think that sounds good, but like actually figuring out what it means to do that and
Mm,
um, to pursue that, to understand that, and then to live out of it. That is not something that I think our culture tends to teach us not to believe our belovedness, but to believe our results or to believe
mm,
our successes, to
mm,
believe our resumes. And there's just a sense of we are always inadequate. We aren't ever enough if we live according to those standards. And I have tried that for most of my life. But if we can start to dig into that place of belovedness, there's a tremendous amount of healing that can happen, which doesn't mean like all pain goes away or there's no problems in your life or in the world anymore. But I do think there's a deeper sense of like being rooted and grounded and connected, and a part of the love of the universe, like the that is at the core, rather than the shame and the fear.
mm. That's powerful. That is powerful. Um, where did I just have my questions? Jake, oh, here they are. Jake, cut that part out. My part. What was amazing to me, and I've only read your books once, but this one I'm reading twice because
Mhm.
I read the draft.
Yeah,
Um, and there's so much in it. I was reading it and thinking, I'm gonna have to read this a third time because it's so dense with wisdom, and it has made me think differently about certain things or more in
mm,
depth about certain things. Um, what was amazing was I knew you so well during those early stages of your life, and I
yeah,
didn't know what you were struggling with. I knew that you had this biological disorder,
right,
and we're talking about something that if you haven't read the book yet, or you're going to, that appeared to look like an eating disorder, but it wasn't a traditional eating disorder. But I never knew you struggled with body image at that time. I
mm,
never would have known that. I never would have assumed that. I mean, part of it was woven into the normalcy of the culture that we lived in at that
yeah,
time, right? but I didn't know that. So it's amazing how you can be so close to someone and still not know what's on the inside, what they're struggling with.
Well, and I think so, yeah, I mean, going just to give people a little bit of the story here, when I was, I mean, I definitely had body image issues that I think go back to both the broader culture we were in as teenagers, as well as my family of origin, where there was just a fair amount of like just conversation around how it was impossible for the women in my family to be fit or thin, and you know, and kind of joking but not really, and a lot of disordered attitude towards both food and exercise, and things like that. But then there also, I think on my part, was a fair amount of shame if I couldn't, in a socially acceptable way, handle food and exercise. So it was like, I can't admit that I'm worried about this, because that breaks the rules. Like, you're not supposed to be worried about your body. You're supposed to just get enough exercise and eat healthily and look exactly the way you think you're supposed to look, and
Mm.
weigh exactly the amount you're supposed to weigh. So I was in denial of my own fear and shame around body image, even though I can look back now. I remember it was later, it was like in college, I found a journal that I had written at the beginning of our sophomore year in high school. And I had literally written a pledge to eat no more than 1,000 calories per day
Wow.
until, I guess, until I hit a certain weight or something. I don't even know. And I had signed it. Like, it was like, I'm
Mm.
vowing to myself that I will do this, which is to say, I'm vowing to shut my body down. I mean, I didn't know that's what I was doing. And I
Mhm.
didn't even, I wouldn't have been able to tell you a month later that I had written it. Like, and yet clearly that was animating a lot of not just action, which I was taking, which was like to not eat very much and exercise a lot, and but also a lot of shame, um
And
and
you were
fear.
14 years
Yeah,
old then.
14
Yeah.
years old.
Mhm.
14 years old.
Mm.
Exactly. And and ultimately this all landed me in the hospital with what was literally a paralyzed stomach,
Yeah.
which then led to a whole series of other things, including what is more conventionally looks like an eating disorder. And yet within all of that, there was just this denial of the psychological, and emotional and spiritual components of it. I just wanted to see it as like a physical problem, um, and
Mm.
address it that way. And it really needed an integrated healing approach.
Well, I've always said you've had a very powerful brain. And if you are telling yourself that you're not going to do something, I have
Right.
no doubt your body will support that, right? Um,
Yeah.
because it's, I mean, you're gifted in that. So, but it's interesting now to hear the story, um, from this perspective at this point, what, 30, what are we, 30 years later or
30 years
something? Oh,
later.
30.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to even hear you say that, because one of the things for me in these past 7 years of like learning about healing and receiving healing is that I have realized that when I was younger, I was told that I had a powerful brain and to be careful not to hurt other people with that. And
Oh.
yeah, which is really interesting for me to recognize as an adult and be like, wait a second, what if I use the gifts I've been given to bless other people? I've been kind of hiding this for my whole life because I'm afraid of hurting people. And sure, I don't want to hurt people. That's good. But that doesn't mean you need to just like shrink back. It means use what you've been given in a way that helps, that blesses. And it's just so interesting hearing you say that, because it's like, gosh, yeah, looking back in high school, it's like, I don't know whether I was hurting other people with my brain, but I was hurting
You're hurting
myself with my
yourself.
brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and just, and yet I also think that it was that same, I don't know, power of thinking that has gotten me in plenty of trouble, but that also both helped me to heal from that eating disorder
Hmm.
slash paralyzed stomach, and ultimately with, a lot of the other healing as well, to be able to say what's going on in my body and how can I not only experience that in my body, but also think differently about it, pray differently about it. That also, there is when there's an integration of mind, body, and spirit, then I do believe there's a lot more healing that can happen.
What's so interesting to me, and I wonder, do you think that's because you were female that you were told be careful not to hurt someone with this brain. Like it was unusual. I just wonder if any males have been told that. Be careful not to hurt someone with your powerful brain. I feel
Right.
like it would have just been affirmed. I don't know, maybe that's coming from the Mount Holyoke background, but
No, I think that
no,
could be it. I
I
didn't
wonder.
often, yeah, I mean, I think in some ways there was, yeah, I don't know. That would make sense to me, but I didn't experience one thing that actually having a powerful brain was nice in was that I felt confident around men, like in a classroom, in a way
Yeah.
that I know a lot of my peers did not, right? And that I appreciated. Like, I was grateful for that. But there was a sense of like, don't get too high on yourself. Don't, and again, I don't want to be some prideful person, but if that means hide who you are, rather than like bringing your full self, believing that that is actually going to be good for the people around you, for you to be
Hmm.
you,
Hmm.
that was a balance that it took me a long time to even begin to strike.
Um, a couple things that you talk about in this book. I want to make sure that we get to some of these other things. There's so much. I swear we could do a series on this book. I mean, this book is about Jesus, and what I
Mm,
loved about this book is you don't talk about Christianity per se, but you talk about Jesus, who he
yeah.
was as the healer and what he taught us about healing. And you really did make me think about some of these stories that I've thought about for so long, but just putting it into context with this bigger picture of healing. Lately, the I think it was Mark 11:24 when Jesus went into his hometown and he said he couldn't do many miracles there. And then
Yeah.
it goes on to say all he could do was heal some people. Like that was no big deal. Right?
Right.
Like here, this is what we're focused on and praying for. But there's so many bigger things that
Mm,
he wanted to do. And he was like, oh, all I could do is just like heal some people.
yeah.
So it was almost like reading it as the healing again was just the beginning, but there
Hmm.
were bigger things that healing is supposed to open us up to.
Yeah.
And you do write about that in your book, some of those bigger things. And you talk about social healing,
Hmm.
you talk about individual healing. And one of the questions I had when I was reading this was, which comes first? Do we have to be healed as individuals? Because we're dealing with a really fractured world when it comes to
Yeah.
politics, when it comes to race. And I do have a race question for you later.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's so fractured. Do we have to first be healed to participate in that social healing? In your perspective, how does this work?
Yeah, I've been asking the same question because
Mm,
I do think I've been thinking about that line, hurt people,
yeah.
and
Hmm.
the way that if we have been wounded, we tend to bring that wounding out into the world.
Hmm.
And I think the inverse is true, that if we've begun to experience healing, we can bring that healing. And we see that even in those stories of Jesus where he'll tell someone not to talk too much about the fact that they've been healed and they can't contain it. And so they tell all these people, and all
Yeah.
these people come and they get healing. And there's just this sense of like a contagious healing that happens. So I do think that we need to be careful before we try to go out and like save the world, to make sure that we have actually done some work to like listen and pay attention to pain, whether that's our own pain or the pain around us, and to just be humble before that. And that understanding of like, if I understand myself as beloved, I'm going to understand other people that way.
Mm,
So I do
mhm,
think like healing begets healing.
mhm.
I also, though, think that we are not simply healed as individuals, and honestly, not simply healed in our individual relationship to God, but actually we are healed in a corporate sense. That like that's how healing needs to happen. And so again, so many of those stories in the Gospels, Jesus sends people out into their communities, both
Mm,
because part of their healing is being restored to community. So many people were rejected because of having leprosy or bleeding, or certainly in the case of death, people were rejected by their communities because of what was physically going on in their bodies. So part of their healing is being restored to community, but then there's also a sense in which they're being sent out to bring the healing into the community. Like, so there's a
mhm,
both and there. And I
mhm.
think that's true for us as well. So I think we see people who are either like in kind of like performative social justice, right? Like I'm just
Yeah.
saying the words and I'm doing
Posting
the
it,
thing,
right.
right? But it's not like deeply rooted. But we also see people who are, or we see people who I think bring kind of a toxic anger and negativity and judgment into what is meant to be a social healing space, right? Where it's like, that's all righteously correct. And yet it seems to be tearing down instead of building up. But I don't think we need to be like perfectly well and healed in order to participate in some like bigger healing work. And in fact, I think as we encounter people and as we see relationships mending, as we see justice being transformative in people's lives, that in and of itself can be a part of our own healing. So I think it's all interrelated, but I do think like that sense of self-care and receiving God's love in ourselves is really crucial to being a part of like a bigger healing work.
It's interesting how you talked about the 2 commandments, about Jesus saying what are the most important things, right? Loving God and then loving your neighbor as yourself. And it almost seemed in the context of you writing about healing that was a path to healing, right? Just if we can really prioritize loving God, being connected to God, and then taking care of other people and loving other people, those are vehicles that will facilitate our own healing. And I mean, I know I wrote about the impact of connection on our lives, being connected to other people and all the health benefits that go along with that. But it sounds like from what you're seeing, that is kind of the completion of our healing, or at least maybe not the completion, but part of what facilitates the healing is then going out into the community and either healing others or being healed in connection.
Totally. And I think one of the ways I first was made aware of this was in having a child with a disability. Because when Penny was first born, I very much, so my daughter Penny, for listeners who don't know, is 16 now and has Down syndrome. But so when she was born, I knew
she's 16. I can't even believe she's 16. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
And she's an amazing cheerleader too, by the way. I watch all her videos.
She's an amazing cheerleader.
Sorry, keep going.
But when she was born, I had like a medical model of disability, which is that like the problems are in her and in her body, and we will fix as many of them as we can, and that will be the best we can do for this child or something like that. As opposed to, what if the problem lies in our perceptions of what it means to be a contributing member of society? What if the problem lies in the disconnection or the social rejection that she will potentially experience, whether it's from peers or from other people? And I started to see, to your point, like the ways in which the social connection, and of course like spiritual connection as well, but social connection has so much to do with how we understand ourselves, and honestly with health, like with our physical, emotional, and spiritual health. That sense of being belonging in community and being a valuable member, not just a like, not, oh, people are nice to me, but like I have a place and a meaningful contribution to make here, is so important. And I think, I mean, we see that in so many measures, right? Like, I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but loneliness and like smoking 2 packs of cigarette a day basically have the same effect on your lifespan. Like, it's like amazingly.
I think the loneliness is worse.
Okay.
And what they've come out with in the research. Yeah, right. It has more detrimental effects than smoking 2 packs.
Yeah. So that's what I mean in terms of just like we are such social creatures. Like, we so need one another. And that is so integral to our health and our well-being. And if we only think about health in terms of these like physical metrics, of like what I weigh when I get on a scale, or, what my body feels like when it comes to pain, we're missing out on some really important aspects of what it means to be healthy.
I loved how you just said a little while ago, if we can see our own belovedness, then it's easier to see that in other people. And I think also, because I loved the analogy that you used towards the end. How do you pronounce that?
Kintsugi?
Yes, kintsugi. Yeah. I love that. You wrote here, and I want you to explain what that is. By honoring the brokenness, the broken shapes can somehow be a necessary component of the new world to come. The beauty comes not by trying to cover over or ignore the brokenness, but by transforming the brokenness. When we can see our own brokenness and still see value, and still see worth, it's easier to have grace for someone else's brokenness as well. Right. Can you explain?
Yeah. Let me explain. And I was going to say grace and hope, because,
And hope. Hmm.
I think the beautiful, so there's an image, there's a practice, like an artistic practice that comes out of Japan called kintsugi. And it is the practice of when a piece of pottery, so like a bowl, a cup, a teapot, shatters or breaks or cracks in some way, instead of simply repairing it by trying to hide the fact that it had cracked, it's using a material. It's basically like liquid glue that is made out of gold, in
Mm.
order to put those pieces back together. So it's very evident that this was once a different bowl, and it cracked and was pieced back together. Like, there's no question that it broke, but it's meant to be more beautiful than it was originally, because of that gold that is now not only putting it back together, but also putting it back together in a very unique way. There's no other bowl that cracked exactly the same way. Like, they might have been mass produced, but they're not anymore. Like, and
Mhm.
so there's a beauty, and there's also a drawing attention to the broken places that have healed, rather than a sense of these need to be like ignored or avoided or be seen as shameful in some way. So I just love that analogy, because I think I've often thought about human beings as broken beyond repair, and I've also thought about, if we are made new, it's kind of this like magic wand trick that God does, rather than taking the pieces
Mm.
that have been broken and using those, like, in the midst of our brokenness, bringing beauty and bringing healing. But that's what we see certainly in the body of Jesus with the resurrection. But we also see it even in, like, I was reading the story of, I think it's Jacob, who gets in a wrestling match with God, and his hip gets put out of joint, like, permanently. He always walks with a limp. And that is when the blessing of God comes. So there's like a brokenness and a blessing at the
The
same
same
time.
time.
That
Mm.
is, Jesus saying, blessed are the ones who mourn, the meek,
Mm.
the poor in spirit. Like, right now, in the midst of the brokenness that you are experiencing, you are blessed. It's really mysterious. And yet also, there's a sense of, instead of having to clean up our lives and then come to receive a blessing, instead of God being like a magician who just waves a magic wand and makes everything all better, what if we could experience the belovedness and the blessing of God in the midst of our very real and broken lives, and begin to see the beauty that can come out of that? That's when I think we
Mm.
do have grace for ourselves, have grace for one another, but also have hope that,
Hmm.
like, even this brokenness is a part of the healing, the redemption, and the mending, the bringing, piecing back together of our lives and our world.
And I do think the beauty that comes from brokenness can only come from God. I mean, it can come from God. It can also come through connection, right? Because
Oh,
when
yeah.
I've seen people go through brokenness, and I feel like that's how God works. He works with people around us that He puts in our lives. And I've seen people go through really difficult times. There's beauty in the connections that happen after that, in the support, but also, I mean, ultimate beauty. We're talking about the all things working for good beauty. That's
Yeah.
something that I feel like only God can do. I really do. And we have to believe in that promise. And when we do, He will. I went
Yeah.
I went to the memorial this summer of a very good friend who died young and tragically.
Yeah.
And his brother-in-law, when he was giving his talk about him, said this one line. He said, God can take the broken pieces and make masterpieces. And
Mhm.
it reminded me of everything that you wrote about. It
Yeah.
is, I feel like that is that, like you said, the magic wand of God,
Right.
that only He can do. Mm. Okay, so in looking at our brokenness, this is where I need your help. Um, it recently I've come up with this situation. I mean, you're writing about how our world is fractured when it comes to race and privilege, and this
Yeah.
season that we've come out of. And I love that you talk about David Bailey and the stories, and his wisdom in your book as well. But it was brought to my attention recently, and I know that this conversation goes on, and this is part of a larger
Yeah.
conversation that you and I need to have off camera sometime as well. Um, but because racism is really insidious and people aren't even aware of it, obviously. but it was brought to my attention that there are women, and first I was wondering, are these Black and Latina women? And then I realized no, because they've never undermined my experience as a woman of color. Christian white women who have said over the years that I don't really have a right to talk about racism because I'm brown and not Black, and because of my own privilege socioeconomically, I don't understand what that's about. Now, these are people who love Jesus, and I love them. Like, wow, this is so interesting that when this is coming from Christian women, but also it's coming from white women who really never have experienced racism.
Right.
I acknowledge my privilege all over the place. I do. And I'm always praying, God, how do you want me to use this? How do you want me to steward this?
Yeah.
But having grace for those conversations is difficult for me now with everything that we've gone through and all the information that's been made available to people. So you're always my resource on
Unprivileged
what-
women.
unprivileged white women. Like, what do I say that is kind? And I'm always looking at these experiences, much like any pain, physical, emotional, whatever. God, how do you want me to use this? What are you trying to say to me through this? How is this exposing my own brokenness? Because I can't get mad about this.
Right.
That's not the right response. That's not the response that God wants me to have. I want to actually look at this as an invitation, as you said, into deeper work.
I mean, it does make me ask the question of like, so there's one part of me that feels dismissive and is like, yeah, just shake the dust off and like, don't pay attention to them.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
so,
yeah.
And I do think there is a place when, even again, going back to Jesus, like he is not pushing healing on people. Like he really is saying, what do you want me to do for you? Like that's a question he asks people. He doesn't just like think he knows how they want to be healed and just like Shazam all over the place. There is some encounter. And so I do think that's important for us, like that sense of, what is it that you actually want? Like being curious about our own motives and about other people, and being like, it's not a bad thing to protect yourself. It's not as though you just need to like give and give and give and be kind and kind and kind, because there is a sense of like, if you are being, I think like not seen in your fullness by other people, like just because you are beautiful and professional and have gotten all sorts of things right? Like you've got a beautiful family and you're married to a doctor and you own your own business and all of these things that are amazing about you.
Which is also why people have said that I don't have a right to talk about contentment.
I know, but it's
right.
Right. That does not mean that you have not experienced racism or that. I mean, and I do think this conversation, if you were someone who wasn't listening to the stories of people who were in a different socioeconomic or, demographic position than you are, then maybe there'd be a reason for saying that. But I just think, like, what is that about? I think, again, that may be more on the like performative side of things where it's like, we're just supposed to center this type of voice or listen to these types of people. And so you need to be quiet. And so do I. I guess my point here is just that I think we do each have to speak with humility. And as you said, like use what we've been given to be a part of the healing, but also like not pay too much attention when people tell us that's not what we're doing. Like, I mean,
yes. Yeah.
And I don't mean like arrogant
you.
about it, because obviously we can bring any of that before God and say, and before trusted other people and be like, hey, will you help me know if this is what I'm doing? Because what I want to be doing is this, but I'm actually doing this. But yeah, that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. I mean, part of it is, one, I know that God has told me you don't have to justify my call in your life or the way I've chosen to lead you on your path. You need to steward that. You need to give it back. You need to figure out how to make that meaningful, but you don't have to justify it. Part of the reason I engage in these conversations is because of my privilege as a brown person and not a Black person.
Totally.
I don't want those conversations to fall on Black women who are far more exhausted, and should not have to have them. So I've always felt like because yes, there is less discrimination. Some of the stereotypes are favorable. I'm actually not good at math, no matter what people think. My kids know this very well. My first grader does not want me to help her with her homework.
Right.
So, stand in that gap and have that conversation
Yeah.
because of it. But so that's, I think, where I have the conflict. But I'll tell you what, one of the things, because one of the questions I was asking, I wanted to ask you is, and I know we're running short on time. I have two quick questions. It's like, what prevents us from our own healing? And what I'm coming up against is pride is a big piece of it.
Yeah.
Pride to confront what's going on. But when we all of a sudden come to the table by saying, I'm not going to listen to this person because of assumptions I've made
Right.
about that person. That's kind of a kind of a disguise for pride, right?
Yeah.
It's a facade for pride to say that that person can't speak to me because of these assumptions that I've made.
Yeah, I do think that's where there are lots of barriers to healing. And one of them absolutely is pride. And it's essentially that can, I guess, show up in a lot of different ways. Like it can show up when we won't ask for help because we need to be able to take care of it ourselves. Like even if we
Mm,
acknowledge that there is a problem and we won't ask for help. Or to your point, in that sense of like there are only certain types of people who are
mm,
allowed to help here. And I think that can go in both directions. What you're describing is people who are basically saying you're not allowed to help because you're too educated or too, wealthy or professional or whatever. You could imagine a scenario in which it's like, well, you're not allowed to help because you're not educated enough or you're not wealthy enough. You don't bring enough to the table.
absolutely.
And
Hmm.
that sense of like, no, all of us are actually like a part of the solution, so to speak. Like we are all invited at least to be people who contribute because we've all been gifted. We've all been um, equipped with something that the world needs as a part of its healing, even though oftentimes we don't recognize that about ourselves or about one another. So I think you're absolutely right. The pride in different forms can be a barrier to personal healing, but also to social healing. And that goes back to the idea of status in these kind of complex ways, separating us from one another instead of recognizing our common need. Like we all have need, even if it
Mm,
looks really different, but we
hmm.
also all have um, the possibility of giving to others. And so I think that is our responsibility to say, what is it that I need so that I can stay humble? And what is it that I have to give so that I can stay like a participant in healing?
Mm. I love that. I love that. And also, like you said, how God can use anyone and anything, right, to speak if we are connected to God, like your yoga teacher
Yeah,
who came to deliver this message, which ultimately became a book,
right,
right? Who is not a Christian,
right.
but who God used powerfully in that moment because you were
Totally.
open and you were connected to God.
Yeah.
So I love that message in this. The big question, of course, with 1 minute left, what about when God doesn't heal?
Yeah. That is, I mean, I think
It's
so. There are a
lots of
couple.
prayers, right? And even you write about it in your book about
Yeah.
there was a certain time where prayers failed you and everything that you were using failed you when God
I
doesn't
mean,
heal.
like I can look back in my own life and say God was saying not yet, and I
Hmm.
think sometimes people can speak to that and say, now I can see that it just was, needed to take a different course or take longer. But I think there also are people who've had experiences where it's like, I've done everything that I know how to do and I'm still in pain. Or we prayed and prayed and prayed and she still died, or like it's like
Yes.
really, really over. So some of this is a mystery that is not going to be answered. I think some of it is recognizing that while God longs to heal, there is brokenness in the world, there is sin in the world, there is pain and suffering. And sometimes our bodies, through no fault of our own, are bearing witness to the pain in the world and the
Mm,
brokenness of the world. And I don't know why that's true for some people and not for others, but I think it's really important that we not, it would be really easy to say, well, you clearly haven't prayed hard enough or believed enough, or, it's really easy to put shame on top of pain. And
Mm.
I think it's really good to get curious about pain, to ask those questions, to look for help, to, examine pride, all of those things, to believe our belovedness. But I don't think it's a formula that like spits out healing in the ways that we expect it, no matter what. And Catherine Wolfe is another example of this, who wrote the foreword to the book and just was able to speak to the fact that as someone who had a really, horrible brainstem stroke at the age of 26, and now 14 years later uses a wheelchair and is blind in one eye and deaf in one ear, has both received like wounding and healing. And God has been a
Mm.
part of all of that in, again, some like really beautiful and powerful and inspirational ways, and in other ways that are, I remember her saying like, God hurt my feelings, like this is really hard, and let's not pretend that that's not true. So
Mm.
I don't think I have some like quick and easy answer for the pain that exists in the world. But I'm really clear that it's not because people just haven't gotten their, healing prayers right or something like
Or
that.
done
Yeah,
enough, right?
yeah,
Again, the
exactly.
performative piece of trying to achieve healing. Yeah,
Right.
and I love how you talk about in the book, in those times that God gave you himself. He gave you himself, his presence, his words,
Yeah.
his wisdom.
And I do think, actually back to that whole idea of like Jacob being blessed. He got the blessing and he got a permanent limp. Like it hurt for the rest of his life, Like,
But then generations were blessed as well,
right,
right? So,
right, exactly. And so there is a sense of, that is mysterious and hard. And there's a lot of reason to believe that even if we have, Paul, thorn in the flesh, like there's a lot of reason to believe that his thorn in the flesh was not just like some spiritual thing, but like that there was some physical pain associated with it. Even just those words, thorn in the
mm,
flesh, like that's terrible.
mhm.
And what was that? We don't know. But that idea that God was like, no, I'm not going to take that away because my grace is sufficient for you. Okay, so many of us might be asked to be in that place where it
Mm,
doesn't get taken away. And that actually does not in any way mean that God's presence is not totally with us, and that like God's grace is also very present and healing us in different ways than what we might have expected.
mm. So much wisdom in this book, very reflective of you and who you are. And
Oh, thank
I'm
you.
excited to see this come out into the world very soon. Very soon.
Yes.
Have people gotten their books yet? Some people who've
No,
pre-ordered
I
the book?
know I know you've had a little early release of some books, but as far as I know, anyone who has pre-ordered the book will receive it on March 15th, which is the day that it
Awesome.
comes out. That's what I've been
Awesome.
told.
So this episode's coming out this Sunday, and your launch party, which is that
Yes,
conversation with
yes.
Catherine Wolfe and
Yep.
someone else
And
too, right?
and David Bailey,
Oh, and
who is
David Bailey too.
yeah, and David Bailey is the leader of a ministry that does reconciliation work with churches and nonprofits.
It's amazing. So that is actually going to be Monday night, the day after
Yes.
this podcast. So if you're listening to this, please, please go on Amy Julia's website,
Yeah.
sign up to be a part of that conversation. It will be time completely well spent. You will have your mind blown with how much you learn from these three amazing, amazing, gifted individuals. And I believe that's going to be a very spiritual experience as well by attending that launch
Yeah,
event.
I would
So
love
I'll
to
be
have you.
there. I'll be there. So
Yay!
I'm so happy for you. Thank you for taking this time and sharing
Thank you
this
for
with
having
us.
me.
Anytime. I'll have you anytime. But I'm really excited about this book, and I know this in and of itself is a gift of healing that you're putting out in the world. So thank you.
Thank you.